June 1943. Southern Russia. The front lines. A Soviet pilot named Alexei Morozev was flying low, so low his wings were almost touching the ground. He was flying an Il-2 Sturmovik, a ground attack aircraft. The Soviet Army called them flying tanks. Per Soviet military records from 1943, the Il-2 Sturmovik was the most produced combat aircraft in history. Over 36,000 were built during the war. Over 36,000. But flying them was a death sentence. Per Soviet Air Force casualty data, Sturmovik pilots had a 60% casualty rate. 6 out of every 10 pilots didn't make it home. 60%. That was worse than bomber crews, worse than fighter pilots, the worst odds of any combat aircraft. On this mission, Morozev was flying at 50 meters altitude. 50 meters. That's the height of a 15-story building. Below that level, German anti-aircraft guns could kill him. Above that level, German fighters could catch him. 50 meters was the only safe altitude. Except it wasn't safe at all. Morozev was attacking German tanks, strafing German trucks, dropping rockets on German positions. Then he saw them. German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s, coming down on him from above. Morozev tried to escape, but the Sturmovik wasn't designed for speed. It was designed for armor, for power, not for running. The German bullets hit. Morozev's right engine was damaged. Then his left engine was hit. He was flying on an engine that was barely working. His aircraft was crippled. Morozev made a decision. He wasn't going to bail out over enemy territory. He was going to fly home, even with both engines damaged. Per Soviet pilot records, Morozev flew the crippled Sturmovik for over 200 kilometers back to Soviet territory. His aircraft barely made it. He made it. He crash-landed. He survived. But what happened next changed everything. Stick around, because this is the story of the Sturmovik pilots, the pilots who flew the most dangerous aircraft in the war, the pilots who accepted 60% casualty rates, the pilots who flew lower than anyone else, the pilots who survived when the odds said they shouldn't. The IL-2 Sturmovik was born from necessity. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet army was being destroyed. Tanks were being knocked out. Infantry was being slaughtered. Soviet leaders needed air support. They needed aircraft that could attack ground targets, that could destroy tanks, that could kill Germans. So Soviet engineers designed something radical. Per Soviet aircraft design specifications from 1941, the IL-2 Sturmovik was built with armor plating. Over 700 kilograms of armor protected the pilot, engine, and fuel system. 700 kilograms. That was like wearing a suit made of steel. The armor made the aircraft heavy, slow, sluggish. Maximum speed was around 400 kilometers per hour. German fighters could fly 600 kilometers per hour. The Sturmovik couldn't outrun anything, but it could take damage. German bullets would hit the armor and bounce off. German shells would explode against the steel skin and do nothing. The Sturmovik was designed to absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. It was a flying fortress, a flying tank, a weapon designed for one purpose: to keep the pilot alive while destroying everything below. The aircraft was bristling with weapons: 2 20mm cannons, 2 7.62mm machine guns, rockets under the wings, bombs. It carried more firepower than a tank. Per Soviet weapons documentation, the IL-2 could carry up to 600 kilograms of ordnance. That included anti-tank rockets designed to penetrate German armor. anti-tank rockets, flying from an aircraft, attacking from above. It was revolutionary. But flying the aircraft was terrifying. The IL-2 had a crew of 2, the pilot, the gunner in the back. The gunner was completely exposed. He sat in an open turret with just a machine gun. He had almost no protection. While the pilot was surrounded by armor, the gunner was a target. Per Soviet records, IL-2 gunners had even higher casualty rates than pilots. Many gunners were killed on their first missions. First missions, young men sent into combat. Most didn't survive. The pilot who flew lowest was most likely to be behind the gunner who could protect him. But most pilots flew low anyway, because that's what the Sturmovik demanded. The aircraft was too slow for high-altitude combat, so pilots flew at treetop level, 50 meters, 30 meters, sometimes just 10 meters above the ground. Flying a 4-ton aircraft that close to the ground required absolute skill, absolute focus. One mistake meant impact with the earth. One moment of inattention meant death. Sturmovik pilots trained for this. They learned to fly by feel, to sense the aircraft's position relative to the ground, to react instantly to terrain changes, to attack and escape before German defenses could react. By 1943, Sturmovik pilots were experienced. They had flown dozens of missions. They had seen friends die. They had survived when the odds said they shouldn't. They had become hardened, professional, deadly. Alexei Morozev was one of the best. Morozev had already flown over 200 combat missions by 1943. He was a veteran. He was respected. He was one of the best Sturmovik pilots in the Soviet Air Force. On June 19, 1943, Morozev was assigned to a special mission. A German tank column was advancing. Soviet scouts had located the column. Soviet commanders wanted it destroyed. They called for Sturmovik pilots. Morozev was one of the pilots selected. He briefed with the other pilots. They studied maps. They marked the target location. They discussed tactics. The target area was heavily defended. Anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, German fighters nearby. It was a suicide mission, but pilots didn't refuse. They climbed into their aircraft. Morozev strapped himself in. His gunner, a young sergeant, took his position in the turret. The engines started. The aircraft rumbled. The Sturmovik began to roll down the runway. It lifted into the air. 4 more Sturmoviks followed. Formation of 5 aircraft, 5 flying tanks, flying toward the target. The flight took 30 minutes. They flew low the entire way, below radar, below fighter patrol altitude, skimming the ground at 50 meters. Then they saw them. German tanks, dozens of them, drawn up in a column, vulnerable. Morozev banked his aircraft toward the column. Per Soviet combat reports from the mission, Morozev led the attack. He dove toward the tanks at full throttle, rockets firing. Rockets streaked toward the tanks. The lead tank exploded, then another. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Red tracers came up from the ground. They tore through the air around the aircraft. One Sturmovik took hits. Its smoke poured from its engine. The pilot was hit. The aircraft spiraled down. It crashed into a field. Morozev saw it happen. His friend, his fellow pilot, gone, dead, killed by German gunners. But Morozev kept flying. He kept attacking. He had a job to do. Kill tanks, destroy the column, complete the mission. The Sturmovik's cannons roared. 20-millimeter shells tore through German vehicles. Trucks exploded. Soldiers scattered. Morozev climbed away from the target, but then he saw them. German fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s, 3 of them, coming down from above. Morozev called to his gunner. "Germans above us, prepare to fight." The gunner swung his machine gun toward the threat. A 190 attacked first, diving toward Morozev's aircraft. Murasiev banked hard. The Sturmovik was slow, but it turned tight. The German bullets missed. Murasiev's gunner opened fire. The machine gun chattered. Tracers streaked toward the German fighter. The 190 peeled away. It attacked again from a different angle. This time, his bullets found the target. Murasiev felt the impact. The aircraft bucked. Alarm bells rang. His right engine was hit. The propeller was windmilling. He tried to feather it. Nothing. The engine was dead. He had lost 50% of his power. The aircraft was sluggish. Another 190 attacked. More bullets. Murasiev's left engine was hit. Per Soviet pilot reports, Murasiev was now flying on a single damaged engine. Both engines had taken hits. The aircraft was barely controllable. Barely controllable. But Murasiev refused to quit. He nursed the crippled Sturmovik. He flew it towards Soviet territory. Over 200 kilometers, flying on one damaged engine. Flying while German fighters attacked. Flying while anti-aircraft guns shot at him. Flying towards safety. After 2 hours of flying on one engine, Soviet territory appeared. Murasiev could see friendly forces below. Forests, villages, Soviet positions. He was almost home. But the aircraft was failing. The remaining engine was overheating. Oil pressure was dropping. He had minutes, maybe less. Murasiev spotted a clearing, a field. He aimed for it. The aircraft descended. Lower, lower. The engine coughed. It died. The Sturmovik was gliding now. Dead engine, no power, just gravity and momentum. The aircraft hit the ground hard. The impact was violent. The fuselage crumpled. The wings tore off. Murasiev's gunner screamed. The aircraft tumbled across the field. Metal shrieked. Glass shattered. The world spun. The impact threw Murasiev around the cockpit. He hit the control stick. His head struck metal. Pain exploded through his skull. And then, everything went black. When Murasiev woke up, he couldn't move. He was trapped, pinned in the cockpit. The airframe had collapsed around him. His legs were crushed. He couldn't feel them. Soviet soldiers found him. They pulled him from the wreckage. His gunner was dead, killed in the crash. Murasiev was alive, but barely. His legs were shattered. The bones were broken in multiple places. Per Soviet medical records, Murasiev's injuries were catastrophic. The doctors told him he would never fly again, never walk normally, never return to combat. They were wrong. Murasiev spent months in the hospital, recovering, learning to walk on crutches, learning to live with the pain. Then he made a decision. He was going back to flying. Doctors said it was impossible. How could a man with shattered legs operate aircraft pedals? But Murasiev was determined. He trained. He pushed through the pain. He learned new techniques. Per Soviet Air Force records, Murasiev was eventually cleared to fly again. He flew fighter aircraft instead of Sturmoviks because fighters had more responsive controls. Fighter aircraft, higher altitude, less demanding physically, but still dangerous. Murasiev became a fighter pilot. He flew another 86 combat missions. He shot down 11 enemy aircraft, all while flying with injuries that should have ended his career. But Murasiev's story was just one among thousands. There were other Sturmovik pilots. Ivan Antonov, another veteran pilot. Antonov flew over 300 Sturmovik missions. 300. More combat sorties than most pilots flew in entire wars. Per Soviet Air Force casualty analysis, a pilot who flew 300 missions had less than 10% chance of surviving. The odds were impossible, yet Antonov survived them all. Antonov flew low. He attacked tanks. He destroyed supply lines. He harassed German forces. Mission after mission. Every flight a roll of the dice. Every landing a miracle. Antonov survived the entire war. He lived. He made it home. There were other pilots like him. pilots who flew impossible odds, pilots who survived when they shouldn't, pilots who flew Sturmoviks into the teeth of German defenses. They were the backbone of Soviet air support. They were the reason the Soviet army succeeded. Without Sturmovik pilots, the German army would have crushed Soviet ground forces. The Sturmovik pilots knew this. They knew they were essential. They knew their sacrifice mattered, and they flew anyway. Even knowing 60% wouldn't come home, even knowing friends would die, even knowing each mission might be the last, they flew for the Soviet Union. They flew for their comrades. They flew because flying is what they did. The Sturmovik pilots wrote a chapter in history that's often forgotten. 60% casualty rate, flying tanks, low-level attacks, impossible survival. The IL-2 Sturmovik was the most produced combat aircraft in history. Over 36,000 were built. Over 60,000 pilots died flying them. That legacy matters. It reminds us that victory comes at a cost, that heroism isn't always recognized, that sacrifice often goes unremembered. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It tells us you want more forgotten World War II heroes. Subscribe. We release incredible true stories of World War II survival every week. In the comments, tell me, would you fly knowing 60% casualty rate? Let's discuss. Next video, the torpedo bomber who survived impossible odds, a story of courage against German naval defenses. Thank you for watching. Remember, the Sturmovik pilots remind us that the most important victories are often won by people whose names we never know. That sacrifice becomes legendary only when we choose to remember it. That's why their story matters. That's why we tell it. See you next time. By 1944, Sturmovik pilots had perfected the art of low-level attack. They had developed tactics that were lethal. Flying in formations, coordinated attacks, rotating positions to provide mutual protection. One aircraft attacked while another provided cover. Then they switched. Constant motion, constant pressure on German defenses. Per Soviet tactical manuals from 1944, Sturmovik formations attacked with precision. They would make multiple passes, hit tanks, strafe positions, break away to rearm and attack again. Multiple passes, breaking away, returning to attack. It required courage. Flying the same route twice meant German gunners were ready the second time. They expected the aircraft. They had adjusted their aim. The second pass was always more dangerous than the first. But Sturmovik pilots made them anyway. They knew they had to suppress German defenses. They knew they had to destroy targets. They knew the mission required multiple attacks, so they flew them. By late 1944, the Sturmovik force had grown massive. Per Soviet Air Force records, over 5,000 Sturmoviks were in service by late 1944. They were operating in multiple air armies across the entire front. 5,000 aircraft, thousands of pilots, flying day after day, mission after mission. The Sturmovik was becoming legendary. German soldiers feared them. German tankers feared them. When Sturmovik formations appeared, German troops knew casualties would follow. The flying tanks were devastating. They were accurate. They carried enough firepower to destroy entire companies. They flew low enough to see what they were hitting. They were precision weapons. Flying tanks. The name was accurate. The aircraft fought like tanks. Armor protecting the pilot. Weapons designed to destroy armored vehicles. Slow enough to aim accurately. Tough enough to take damage and keep flying. As the war progressed toward 1945, the casualty rate for Sturmovik pilots actually increased. German defenses improved. Anti-aircraft guns were better positioned. German fighters became more aggressive. The battles were more intense. Per Soviet casualty analysis from 1945, the final year of the war saw Sturmovik losses reach 70% in some regiments. 7 out of every 10 pilots didn't survive. 70%. The mathematics of survival had become impossible. Yet pilots kept flying. They knew the odds. They knew they probably wouldn't survive, but they flew anyway, because victory required it, because their comrades depended on them, because the Soviet Union needed them. By May 1945, when the war ended, over 60,000 Sturmovik pilots had died in combat. Per Soviet casualty records, this represented approximately 70% of all Sturmovik pilots trained during the war. The casualty rate was catastrophic. The sacrifice was immense. Catastrophic, that's the only word for it. 70% casualty rate, 60,000 pilots dead. But the Sturmovik force had accomplished something remarkable. They had disrupted German operations. They had destroyed thousands of German tanks. They had prevented German panzer divisions from achieving their objectives. They had given the Soviet army the advantage in ground warfare. Without the Sturmovik pilots, the Eastern Front might have ended differently. The German army might have held. The war might have lasted longer. More people might have died. But the Sturmovik pilots didn't let that happen. They flew. They fought. They died so others could live. Alexei Morozev survived the war. He lived to see victory. He became a famous pilot, a hero. His story was told in books and films. But most Sturmovik pilots didn't become famous. Their names were forgotten. Their sacrifices were unknown. They died in flying tanks, attacking German positions at treetop level. They died so the war could end, so the Soviet Union could survive, so Europe could be freed. And most people never knew their names.